All right. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Facilitator Cards live stream. I'm Meg Bolger, and today we are going to be talking about lowering risk. Whoa, there we go. Lowering risk in meetings, trainings, and in conversations. Got a little birthday card there at the end on squeezing that last sentence in. We're going to be talking about lowering risk in these particular settings. And let's see, where should we start? So I've been a facilitator for over 10 years now. And I started by doing gender and sexuality workshops and kind of then more broadly social justice workshops for the first decade plus of my career. I've kind of always been doing social justice conversations. And in those conversations, there is always a high degree of social risk. And when I say social risk, basically like I'm not doing facilitation that's on ropes courses where we're, on zip lines up in the trees. Like there isn't a physical risk, but there is a social emotional risk that is present in a lot of the conversations that I have had and a lot of the trainings and the workshops that I have helped lead and that I have facilitated. And so over the years, I've learned a lot about how we can mitigate those social risks, how we can lower the vulnerability and the feeling of like emotional exposure for people. And I've also seen people do it really poorly. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some of the things that I think that are commonplace habits that don't work to lower that social emotional risk. And we're going to talk about a bunch of structures and strategies that I've used and that I think you can use to help people navigate risky, tricky, heated conversations, trainings, or meetings in your workplace. So let's go ahead and let's jump into the kind of like why these things come up. So there are what do I want to say here? When we have a tricky conversation coming up, whether it's that we're facilitating something that is vulnerable or challenging or personal or heated, whether it's you're having a feedback session with your team about things that aren't working, or that something has happened in the office or in your community that is just like needing to be talked about, but isn't going to be easy to talk about. Those situations happen often. And a lot of times they are actively avoided or kind of like people will not give them the like container and the time they need in order to actually be successful. So I think there's a few kind of key questions that we should ask ourselves when we're going into having a tricky conversation. One question, how are we going to have this conversation? Not do we need to, but once you've answered the do we need to question, the next question is how. How are we going to have this conversation? What are the structures and the strategies and the frameworks that we're going to use to guide us through this experience? You can just kind of like say, we all need to talk about this. But from my experience and probably from your experience, that doesn't lead to the best outcome. So the question of how are we going to have that tricky conversation is a really crucial one to begin with. Question 2 that I think is really important is what vulnerability is required and kind of necessary for this to happen, and in what ways can we lower that experience of vulnerability and kind of lower the risk for that vulnerability. There are, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, but there are a lot of times I see vulnerability being done for the sake of vulnerability. And a lot of times in these tricky conversations, we need people to take risk. We need people to be courageous and be vulnerable and open. But I think we also need to think about what are the ways we need that, and then what are all the different forms we can invite people to do that in, right? Do they need to say it out loud? Do they need to say it where we can attach it to them personally? Do they even have to express it to the entire group? There's a lot of kind of different like layers to, we know we need that information, but what are the different ways we can elicit that information to bring it into the group's consciousness? So I think that's a really important question too, is what vulnerability is absolutely necessary? And then what can we do in order to structure that vulnerability that lowers the risk? Okay, question 3. Let's see. Question 3, what are we going to do with this information after we get it? I think this might be one of the most important questions to ask ourselves when we get into a tricky conversation, or when we are kind of setting ourselves up to have a tricky conversation, run a really vulnerable meeting, training, or workshop, is what are we going to do afterward? Because a lot of times I have seen people ask for people to give real feedback, to get vulnerable, to get real with each other, and then that information goes nowhere. And what that does is that it makes people feel really disillusioned with the process. They're like, why did I have to put myself out there if nothing is going to come of it? It leads to resentment. And it also really tanks our ability to do that in the future. If we ask people to be vulnerable and then we do nothing with the information, the likelihood that they're going to be willing to be vulnerable again decreases dramatically. So it's really important for us, even if it's not articulated to the group, but it's important for any of the leaders or the organizers to know, what am I asking for? And then what am I going to do with that information once I have it? And, in the case of trainings and workshops, it might also be, what do I want them to do once they have that information? Specific calls to action, specific next steps, or just knowing that you have that answer, even if it's not articulated to the group, so that you can make sure that you're asking for that vulnerability for a reason. And the last thing I want to acknowledge before we get into some of those bad habits that I see people do. So the last thing I think that's important to ask ourselves, and to really recognize and reckon with these kind of hot button, tricky conversations, is to understand that vulnerability is more complicated when it's at work. So, I see a lot of conversations happen about how can we give each other real feedback? How can we be open and honest with our colleagues? And something that I think we need to acknowledge continuously when we enter these conversations is that it is a vulnerability at work is a unique and particularly tricky thing to do, because people's livelihoods are attached to their work. And I know we know this on an intellectual level, but I think it can be easy to just not want to navigate the kind of fullness of that situation on a practical level. That asking people to be real with the people who can fire them, the people who can hire them, the people that can give them recommendations in the future, is a particularly kind of high bar to ask people to clear. So I think that's one of the reasons I am really cautious, maybe too strong a word, but I want to be very thoughtful in the ways that I'm inviting people to be vulnerable in front of colleagues, superiors, people they supervise, because that dynamic, when you leave the room, I don't have to deal with it if I'm not employed at that company, but they have to continue to deal with the knock-on effects and the consequences of those actions, right? So I think it's really important for anybody who is organizing an event where they're going to be asking people to take make vulnerable moves or take risks in front of their colleagues and coworkers, or just their peers, their network, at a conference or something like that, to really deal with the kind of gravity of what it means to ask people to do that in front of people who affect their livelihoods and their careers. So just wanted to acknowledge that I think that that's an underlying truth that we have to actively navigate and include when we're deciding what is appropriate and what is not just appropriate, but what people are going to be willing to kind of meet us, right? If we're asking people, can you be this vulnerable? Is it reasonable to ask people to do that in these types of settings? It's always there's so often that it's necessary, but also we have to be conscious of that kind of trade-off and that, that trade-off that people have. So those are just some of the things that are kind of underlying some of my thoughts as we go into this larger conversation. So let's talk about, I'm going to take a water break and then we'll get into the wrong answers. Okay. So when people are leading meetings, trainings, workshops, conversations, where people are going to be taking risk, being vulnerable, answering tricky topics, getting into heated conversations. There are a few things that I see people do that in an effort to lower that risk, to navigate that vulnerability. And some of those things I think are misguided or just don't have the intended effect that we want them to have. And so I want to go over a few of those things before we jump into the structures and strategies that I use that I think can be really helpful in any of those workplaces. So the first thing that I think that, excuse me, the first thing that I see people do to try to navigate vulnerability and lower risk in their sessions is they set ground rules. Now, there's kind of two ways to set ground rules that I think have different levels of impact and different levels of success, basically, when you're when you're doing this. And I'm going to say, like, this isn't going to be all the times. I'm sure that somebody really successfully does the thing that I'm about to say doesn't work. And if you're that person, like, jump into the comments and let me know that, like, you're wrong. It works for me. This is why. And I'm sure that that's true. But on the whole, for the sessions that I've gone to, ground rules are kind of overemphasized, underutilized, and can often lead to this false sense of security that people have, that this is a space where they can show up, be vulnerable, be open, and be safe to do so. They kind of like are there on paper, but not in effect. So let's go over why that is. The first thing that I see people do with ground rules, well, it's more like there are two big ways to do ground rules. One is kind of facilitator created ground rules. You come in with the ground rules already written up and you ask the group basically for their buy-in or agreement to go with these. And then the other is kind of group created ground rules or group norms. I've done both of these in my career, and I think they have very different effects. And they also kind of had very different manifestations in our sessions. So let's just talk about the group created ones to begin. I think that if you're with a group for a long time and you want to see where the group is, what they want, what they're hoping for with each other, then there's probably a time and place for group created ground rules. But when it comes to one-off meetings or just like short meetings, trainings, workshops, conversations, I think that this can lead to a lot of general statements that aren't particularly helpful. So what I mean by that is, like, you say, okay, what are some group norms we want to have for this conversation? And someone raises their hand and is like, respect. And you're like, okay, respect. Yeah. What does that mean to you? And you end up spending a ton of time unpacking basically like how to be good people to each other, often in really broad terms, in really buzzwordy phrases. And I have found that it often doesn't lead to substantial group change. And it also is more like, in theory, these things would be nice, but in practice, we don't know what it looks like. And so we don't know how to actually execute that in the meeting. So personally, I think that if you're going to do group norms, if you're going to do ground rules, it's good for you to go in with the ones that you think are necessary for this conversation and to kind of either get group buy-in or just let them know how these are going to be actioned in the setting, right? So one thing that I used to do is I had a list of group norms, and I would just ask people to read the kind of the 5 or 6 words that were kind of like the bold summary of that group norm, and then I would ask them, what does that mean to you? And those people would kind of iterate on, one of them was like, be as present as you can be. That means phones too. And people would say, well, I think we should try to be present and listen to each other, and phones can really detract from that. And I'd be like, great, okay, next one. And we would move to the next one. Minds are like parachutes. They only work when they're open. What does that mean to you? And it would take about 5 minutes. There were specific reasons I had for each one, and I would let the group really give their voice to it, but I would let the group give their voice to it, but I would start and give us a framework to begin with, right? So I think that can be helpful. And I think for new facilitators, for people who are nervous or they want to make very explicit some expectations of the meeting, I think group norms and ground rules have a place. I also think, though, that they're over-relied upon to actually do the work that we have to do as facilitators. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when we are facilitating a session, if we say, let's say, like respect everyone's time or step up, step back, like this idea of if you're, oversharing, be conscious of that. And if you haven't shared, really like lean into doing so. That idea as a group norm, I have seen presented many, many times, but then it doesn't get enforced or curated by the facilitator themselves. They don't cut people off and they don't explicitly bring people in. And just saying a group norm is not enough to actually make a group norm happen. So that's where I think there's an over-reliance on group norms to actually do the work that we have to model and regulate as facilitators. So that's why I put group norms in my wrong answers for how to lower risk. Isn't because they can't be effective, but because I think they are over relied upon to be effective. And sometimes like they tend to leave people with this false sense, like the facilitator in particular, this false sense of like, cool, well, I said it, now it's up to the group to regulate themselves. So those are just some things to be aware of with group norms. Other things I see people do to lower risk. I would say this one that I want to talk about isn't something I see people to do to lower risk, but I think it is a really destructive thing that I see people do in relationship to vulnerability. So have you ever been in a session or a workshop where people are using vulnerability in order to create this kind of fake sense of intimacy or gravitas with their session? They're asking people to do things that feel really vulnerable so that they can all have this like vulnerable shared experience. I think that that can be really damaging. And I think that can be, what do I want to say? Like, I think that doing that is really playing with vulnerability and people's emotions in a way that I think is kind of like unethical and emotionally irresponsible. So I think it's important that when we are asking people to be vulnerable, that we have a reason for them to do that. And it's not so they can understand the gravity of the situation, because as soon as they're feeling it in their bodies, there's going to be a lot of regulation that needs to happen in the rest of the session, right? So the idea of doing things, one time I was at a conference and the keynote speaker had a section where they just listed a bunch of questions up on PowerPoints and then played one after the other. And what they would ask is for people to stand up or sit down if that thing applied to them. And it started off as something that's really simple, like I went to college, and then we kind of maybe upgraded to like, I'm the first in my family to go to college. We're already starting to get into social risk, right? Because that is revealing of class status, that is revealing of maybe something that was difficult or like a challenge to people, an oppression they experienced, like that's already getting at something that is like kind of socially complicated, but also, to be celebrated. But then they started getting into really personal questions. And one of those questions was, have you or has anyone that you know ever dealt with suicidal ideation? And I saw people stand up for this, which I thought was incredibly vulnerable and brave of them to do, and sit back down. And then the facilitator, the presenter, did nothing with that information. It was just there. It was just asked for and then done nothing with. And that's what I mean by using vulnerability to kind of like create this experience of gravitas and importance. I think that that is a really irresponsible thing for us to do as leaders. And I think if we're asking for vulnerability, there has to be something that we're doing with it. So I think that is something that I see people do around this question of vulnerability and risk that I think is really irresponsible. And I just want to name that I think we need to have intention behind it. And when we're asking for those big moments of vulnerability, there has to be a point. All right. Let's see. And then, I think that's maybe we'll pause there for the wrong answers to how to lower risk in meetings and trainings and conversations. And I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we will get into the frameworks that I think work really well. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the things that you can do to lower risk in conversations, meetings, or trainings that you're leading. There are a lot of different options that we have to lower risk, to navigate and kind of appropriately contain people's vulnerability, to like create containers for their vulnerability, and to make the experience of having a difficult conversation, a tricky meeting, or navigating a really hot or political topic in a workshop easier, right? Our jobs as facilitators, as leaders in these environments is to make it easier for us to get through it. It's not to help people avoid the conversation. It's not to make sure that no one, has an uncomfortable experience in it, but it is to make the experience of what we're trying to do easier. So I spent the first, 10 years of my career doing social justice work. So for me, it was, how can we learn about a topic that is socially, controversial, taboo to some extent? How can we learn about this topic and not feel like destructively uncomfortable? How can we have like tolerance for discomfort, and how can I make it easier for people to ask questions, to learn about something that is difficult, and to, be self-introspective? How can I make that easier throughout the process? If you're in a conversation with a bunch of colleagues and you're trying to make a difficult decision, or you're trying to address something that came up in your community that is like really difficult and bothering people, your job is to make that easier. And there's a lot of like kind of big picture things we can do. And I want to share a bunch of frameworks and kind of specific strategies that you can use when you're needing to get into those difficult moments with a group. Okay, so the first thing that I think is important to do is to take social risk seriously. It is to understand that as social creatures, putting ourselves out there and having people judge us is something that is incredibly risky for us to do. It is like we care a lot about what people think of us, regardless if we should or shouldn't. We do. And especially when it's attached to our livelihoods at work, it is something that we really need to take seriously. So that's why I'm dedicating this whole conversation to this idea of how do we navigate social risk. Is first we have to take it seriously, and then we have to actually program and set ourselves up for it in intentional ways. Okay? So the other thing that I think is really important that I've mentioned earlier in the series is that only asking for vulnerability that you're going to do something with. If you're asking people to be vulnerable, there needs to be a plan of what to do with that information, both in the session and ideally what to do after the session. And the last thing I want to talk about is that we want to set reasonable and specific expectations of behavior, and then we want to enforce that throughout the session. So if we say, I want to make sure we hear from everybody, we have to use structures and frameworks that are actually going to let us hear from everybody. If we want to say, like, there are particular voices that I want to make sure get the majority of the airtime in this conversation because those are the people who raise the concerns, or those are the people who have been most specifically impacted by this action, then actually creating structures and ways to make that happen is really important. So the idea of group norms and ground rules, which we talked about a little bit earlier, I think can be over-relied on. But if we actually make any of those group norms, or we set these expectations, we need to have ways that we're setting ourselves up and the group up for success in actually meeting those expectations. So let's get into let's talk about a little bit what I mean by kind of like structures and frameworks for this conversation, for tricky conversations, for conversations where we're asking people to be vulnerable, to take emotional risk. What do I mean by structures and frameworks? I'm going to need a drink of water, and then we'll get into it. So for those of you who might be new to the channel or just unfamiliar, we make this deck called Facilitator cards. And Facilitator cards are a deck of frameworks and tools and kind of processes that you can use to run meetings, trainings, conversations, your whole business if you're like us. But they're basically a set of structures and processes, ways of thinking through particular questions. So rather than asking, how's everybody doing? And just putting that question out to the large group as just a popcorn share, like whoever goes, I'd be up for hearing from anybody. There are 15 different ways to surface emotions in the deck of Facilitator cards. And why I want to explain that is that, to me, thinking about our invitations for participation as structures allows us to be far more intentional about the actions that we're taking as facilitators. A lot of times when I talk to facilitators, people who run meetings, who are not necessarily like professional facilitators who have been doing this for years, but they're new to the field, or they're managers, they're, leading a nonprofit. They aren't people who spend their days thinking and trying to solve the problems of facilitation. They are thinking about their jobs and their coworkers and their role and, what they're trying to accomplish in their work. And so when they get into a meeting or they are leading a training, they are often like, well, I'm going to present some information and then I'm going to have a conversation. And for me, the have a conversation, there are like 101 ways to have a conversation. And those structures, the ways we have conversations, the ways we invite people to participate, the way that we brainstorm, that we get into the nitty-gritty details of a topic, that we make decisions, that we surface what's going on emotionally for the group, all of those things, the ways we do that, we have a lot of choice in the structures and the frameworks that we use to invite a group to do those different types of actions. So what's awesome about frameworks is that we can use specific frameworks to have tricky conversations and to make those things go more smoothly. It's not going to remove all of the vulnerability. It's not going to remove all the discomfort, but it's more going to create appropriate containers for that vulnerability, for that discomfort to occur in, that can allow people to be more expressive, that can allow people to tolerate actually getting through that conversation without having to check out, without having to distract themselves on their phone. And ideally, it's going to allow us to have that experience as a group, right? A lot of times what we're doing is we're having when we bring people together to have a meeting, a training, a workshop, a conversation, we need to get on the same page and have a shared experience. And so in order for that to happen, we need people to be present, like both physically, but also like spiritually, emotionally, intellectually present. And we will check out if it becomes too overwhelming for our system. So I think structures and frameworks can really help us do that. So what I'm going to spend the rest of the video doing is introducing you to a framework and talking specifically about why I think that's useful for like how it works, and then talking about why I think that's specifically useful for navigating tricky conversations, because these frameworks kind of work on two levels. There's the framework itself, like what is the structure that you can actually use? And then there's the kind of like underlying principle that we can learn from that can allow us to both understand when to implement that framework, but also I think inform some of the choices or the moves that we're able to make as facilitators. So that's what we're going to hop into now. All right. Okay, so the first framework is minute papers. So minute papers is a really simple structure, and this is all it is. When you are about to jump into a topic, a conversation, a question with the group, before asking them to respond out loud, ask them to write down their thoughts for 1 minute. So I'll give you a specific example. If I was going to get into a conversation, let's say I'm in a small, I'm in a small organization, and we are deciding whether we want to start a DEI committee, a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee in our organization. And I could just throw that question out to the large group. Hey, do people think we should start a DEI committee? Or I could use minute papers and say, okay, before we have this conversation, I would like everybody to write down for 1 minute their thoughts on this question. Should we have a DEI committee in our organization? Why the let me backtrack there. So why minute papers is so helpful for challenging conversations and for lowering risk is that it gives people time to process their thoughts without having to do that out loud. Now, some of us, like me, are out loud processors. I have very little problem saying my thoughts out loud and kind of watching what I think happen in live time. For other people, that is an incredibly risky thing, or it's just simply not how their brain works. It's not how they process information. And so what Minute Papers allows everyone to do is have a moment to think through their own thoughts before having to share with a group. That allows them to more carefully curate what they want to share. It allows them to kind of collect their own ideas first, and it gives them, and I don't think we should underestimate this, like a physical, so if you're writing in person, it gives them a physical object, or if we're, online, it gives them something to reference when they're talking. We like having things to look at, to hold when we're sharing. If you imagine it actually lowers the vulnerability of the act itself to have a physical object between two people or something that we're referencing when we're talking. So there's a lot of ways that this really simple structure of minute papers is hugely helpful when we're having difficult conversations. And we don't have to just use it at the beginning of a conversation. We can actually employ it anytime we want to in a conversation. We can say, okay, you know what? This conversation's getting really heated. I want everyone to take 1 minute and write down their thoughts of like what's going on and like what's circling around for them right now. Or you can do that at the end of a conversation and say, we've just talked about a lot of things. How can we now wrap up to go back to our, workplaces or back to the next meeting we have? Like, what do you need to synthesize in order to make sense to transition into your next thing? All of that can be done with a simple minute paper. So that's, that is what the structure is, and that is why I think it's so impactful to use in difficult conversations. So minute papers, bam, really good one. Okay, let's talk about a really different type of structure. So there is a structure that I have used before called sharing with holds. So sharing with holds is basically a particular way to invite sharing from the group. So all of us have probably done a go around share where it's just like, we're literally going around the circle and hearing from everyone or asking people to pass it, John, you pass it to the next person in the Zoom meeting. That's a very simple go around share. Sharing with holds uses the same structure of an expectation that everyone's going to talk, but there's a couple additional rules that make it really impactful. So one is simply the framing. The idea with sharing with holds is that you are going to say to the group, we're going to do an activity where we share the things we have been withholding from each other. And that explicit invitation will often make people go, whoa, okay, because we all have very likely things that we haven't been saying, right? That we haven't been sharing with each other. And sometimes we need that explicit invitation in order to share those things. So part one of sharing with holds is just telling people this is what the structure is. The second part of the kind of structure itself is that everyone's going to share. And the third part, I think most crucially perhaps, is that we are not going to reply to each other when we share. So I think of this as no crosstalk. So if Michael says something and Janine wants to reply to that, we cannot do that within this structure. You only speak for yourself and you only speak for your experiences, your thoughts, your beliefs, your emotions, but you are not responding to what anyone else has said. You are only speaking from the I. And it's not, I think what you said is crap. It's more like, this is what's coming up for me. And the last thing about the structure that I think is really powerful is that there's a timer, right? This idea that we have 10 or 15 minutes to do this, or 5, or whatever it is that you think is most appropriate, but that this structure will end, right? So what can we learn? And that's all you do. You set people up with this idea of we're going to be sharing the things we're withholding. We are going to do this for 10 minutes. We're going to go around the room and we are not going to reply to what each other say. No, I agree. No, I'm piggybacking off of this. No, I disagree. Just speaking for yourself. And that's it. And that's how the structure works. And I've seen it be incredibly effective at getting things out there you need to have a plan for what to do with those things once they're there, but it can be really, really like powerful to just get things on the table that have just been sitting there unsaid under the surface. So what can we learn about facilitating difficult conversations from that structure? One is that sometimes it can feel like things won't end. It can feel like we're about to have this conversation and it could last the entire time, the entire meeting or the entire training. And sometimes just letting people know we're going to have this conversation, but we're not going to have it for more than 15 minutes because there are other things we want to address. Like sometimes that can be really relieving, or it can help people modulate what they're willing or not to share. If somebody was to say, like, I would really like to hear the things you're withholding, and then we're only going to have 15 minutes to actually get into those things, I might share something really different than I would if somebody said, we're going to start with the things we're withholding, and we're going to process, like navigate, deal with, address all of the things that come up for the whole rest of this 90 minutes. I might be more or less willing to take that risk and to put myself out there in different ways, knowing what type of time expectation we are actually working with. This kind of leads me to a disconnected, but I think important thought, or not disconnected. This leads me to a related thought and kind of pro tip that I will offer. And that is when you're asking people to be vulnerable, like be appropriate in how do I want to say this? When we're asking people to be vulnerable, we can modulate how vulnerable we are asking them to be with a really simple structure. On a scale of 1 to 10, I want you to think about something that triggers you, that throws you off, that activates you. But I don't want you to pick anything larger than a 7. We're only going to have a few minutes for this conversation. We're only going to get into this, use this as an example. I don't want to bring up a ton of emotion. So on a scale of 1 to 10, nothing bigger than a 7. Just that little compression and being specific about like, this is all I want you to do, or just the warning of, hey, we're only going to use this as an example and I don't want this to bring up a ton of emotion for you, can give people more agency in what they're like going to share or bring up for themselves. And also like sets reasonable expectations of what is going to happen with this information. So just that like time box, like it's kind of time boxing, but it's also expectation setting that we can do in conversations can make a huge difference to the impact and the feeling of the experience. Okay, I am realizing that I don't want to keep standing, so I'm going to sit down for the rest of our conversation and get into some of these other structures. All right. Let's see what else we got to do. Okay, so let's talk about 3 more structures that we can use to help surface emotions, understand where the group is at, help the group understand where they're at, and actually be able to like lower and how they lower risk in meetings, trainings, and conversations. So first one, these are all really different. So the first one we've got is fill in the gap. So here's how this structure works. You create a sentence stem as the leader, as the facilitator, that everybody is going to fill in the gap of. And let's come up with an example. So one thing that really bothers me at work is blank. Why is that? That might not be the best example. Let me think if I can see if I have another one. Lowering risk. No, let's go with that example. So one thing that bothers me at work is blank. What happens with fill in the gap is everybody is expected to fill in that same sentence stem, and you're really only giving them the rest of the sentence. You're not asking for a paragraph explanation, but just the rest of the sentence to fill in their thoughts. You can do it a couple different ways. You could do a go around share. You could have them all send it into the chat at once, or you could have them, write it down on a piece of paper and all hold it up if you're in person. But the idea of fill in the gap is that everybody's going to say the exact same sentence, but just fill in with their own information. So what can that teach us about lowering risk? One is that how much we're asking people to share influences how much risk they're taking. Just saying when we get really off track in meetings, like just saying that and not having to give a big explanation, that lowers the risk. Also, not having to come up with like a kind of like preamble and then getting into the thing and then more information afterward, but just being able to say the sentence and then say your one piece of information, that also lowers the risk and it increases the likelihood that everybody's going to respond. That is also part of what creates risk in our meetings, our conversations, and our trainings, is if we put ourselves out there and other people don't, that experience of social isolation is really difficult. So oftentimes if we're able to hear from everyone, then it can make you feel like everybody's taking the same level of risk, which like personally can lower the experience of it. So I think something like fill in the gap, where it's a simple structure, it's an easy way to get information out, but you're not asking for a ton of information, can be a really powerful way to lower the risk in a session. Let's look at another structure, completely different, called spectrum questions. So the way spectrum questions works is you provide a spectrum, strongly agree to strongly disagree, and or it could be another spectrum, but we'll just go with that for now. And you might say, I think that our team is working really well together. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. And you ask people to put themselves along that spectrum in order to communicate their opinion. So what I love about spectrum questions is that people can respond simply with movement and with their kind of physical bodies, or if you're online, with their on a Miro board with a sticky note. But they don't have to respond out loud. You can actually get a sense of where the group is without anyone talking, which is a really interesting thing. Talking is often a higher risk activity for a lot of people than just responding with movement. So what I love about spectrum questions is that it allows you to get data from the group without having everybody have to talk. And then you can ask for, so having everybody respond to that can just on the spectrum, and you could decide, you know what? That's all the information we needed as a group. It's just to see where we were as a baseline. I don't need individual people to respond. Or you can kind of invite kind of a second level of risk taking, which is to say, would anybody like to share why they placed themselves where they did, right? And now people who are more willing to take that risk can do that while still getting everybody's input as an entire group. So I think the idea of lowering risk by changing up the modality that people are participating in. Are they talking out loud? Are they sharing by movement? Is there ways for them to respond without having to say a bunch of things in front of the group? I think that can be a really powerful tool for lowering the risk in our sessions. All right, and the last blue card, the last emotion structure we're going to look at for the moment is something called declarative pairs. So what do I want to say with declarative pairs? I don't know what I want to say with declarative pairs. So I'm going to skip that one for now. Got a bunch of others and not a ton of time to do it. So let's skip that. Okay. So all right. Let's look at 3 structures that can help us get a bunch of ideas on the table or get people's thoughts going that can create different ways that we can lower risk within our trainings or our workshops. So first structure is I know versus I wonder lists. So this is a really simple structure, and it's simply that you are going to make 2 lists as a group. One list is things you know, and one list is things that you wonder. And you can do this with any prompt or conversation. And one thing that I really appreciate about this structure, and that I think is really helpful in lowering risk, is cultivating curiosity explicitly. Explicitly inviting curiosity into a conversation can, I think, lower the risk of feeling like we have to know everything. In Western society, and this is, and probably others, but also like in the society that I grew up in, I was explicitly rewarded for knowing things, and I was that was constantly reinforced in the school system, right? You get rewarded for knowing things, not for being curious, not for asking great questions, but for knowing the answers. And so I find that it is sometimes challenging to get people to share, like, what are the things you don't know? What are the things that you are curious about? And I think changing it from an I know, I don't know list to I know, I wonder list allows people to admit things that they don't know within this framework of curiosity, right? So rather than saying, I don't know this, you can say, I wonder this. I am curious about X. And that creates a structure where people can admit things that they not just don't know, but that they can kind of reframe those things that they don't know as points of curiosity. And that can really change the experience of not knowing something. All right, so you want to get a bunch of things, people like talking about the things that they don't know about, or I think the I know, I wonder list would be a really wonderful structure to do that. I think anyway. All right. Let us blaze through a few more. Okay. I am wondering. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so let's look at a structure called opposite thinking. So opposite thinking is when, rather than asking people to make a list of things that they know, or let me give you an example. It's really easy to explain with an example. So with opposite thinking, we're asking the group to think about the opposite of what we ultimately want. So I asked a group of teachers recently, what if you wanted to facilitate a terrible meeting, how would you do it? Give me one example. We could have made a list that said, how would you facilitate a great meeting? We could have made that list, but instead we made the opposite thinking list of how would you facilitate a meeting that you wanted to go terribly. And it was fun, it was fast, people were laughing the whole time. But what that allowed people to do was actually share a bunch of things that they've done or that they have seen other people do in this really explicitly low risk way. I didn't say, what's the worst thing you've ever done in a meeting? That would be or like, how have you destroyed your past meetings, right? That would have been a much more emotionally vulnerable thing to ask. And yet we could get that information out by simply making it a theoretical, how would you run a terrible meeting if you were to try to, right? And so that framework of, kind of explicitly thinking about the thing we don't want and explicitly inviting people to talk about that allows people to make a list of things that they've probably done or, things that they've seen, but that doesn't explicitly call them out, right? It doesn't put them on the spot. It's a theoretical person, a theoretical terrible facilitator. And so I think opposite thinking can be really helpful in that creating a little bit of separation between us and the things that, we know are bad, but also allowing us to see them, address them, and actually ultimately work with them. So I think that can be a really powerful structure. Okay, last ideation structure for the moment is four squares. So four squares is when you have people divide their paper into four, and you might ask them to look at something from four different perspectives or frameworks or timelines. So I'll give you an example. I worked with a group of teachers who were being tasked more and more by their school to have really tricky conversations with their students in their classrooms. So, whether this was the January 6th insurrection or this was the, uprisings after George Floyd's death, a lot of things were happening in the national news that their students wanted to talk about, and that, the average math teacher was being asked to facilitate. And so I wanted those teachers to process what were their goals in that conversation, right? What were the different things that they were aiming to do with their students when they were tasked to do that? Now, I think that's a bit of a loaded question. because a lot of people, I think, would feel like there's right and there's wrong answers. So we did it in 4 squares, and I asked them to think about what is their emotional goal, what was their intellectual goal, what was their spiritual goal, and what was their professional goal in those 4 settings. And being able to look at those different frameworks, I think allowed people to, what happens when they were sharing them with their groups is they could speak to the one that they wanted to. They could speak to the one that jumped out to them or that they felt like willing and able to talk about. So this idea that when we give participants choice, when we allow them to write and reflect before we invite them to share, they can have more agency over what they are actually sharing. And they, I think, we're more willing to be open with each other after having time to write, but also they didn't have to speak to anything in particular when they were sharing. And I think that really lowered the vulnerability and upped the participation in that conversation. Okay, we have a few more structures to look at. So let's look at 2 different ways to get people to ask questions. Getting people to, whoa, I'm hitting my, all right. Getting people to ask questions in a workshop, a conversation, or a meeting can be an incredibly risky thing to do. It is, as we mentioned earlier, not rewarded to be somebody who doesn't know things. And to admit that in front of people by asking a question is often a really vulnerable experience. So I want to give you 2 frameworks that I think lower that risk and encourage people to ask questions in really different ways. The first one, you can probably guess, is anonymously. Giving people an opportunity to ask anonymous questions can dramatically increase the amount of questions you get, the honesty and the kind of specificity of the questions you get, and the types of questions that you get. People are way more likely to ask questions that they know are bigoted, are that they're going to be judged for, that there's social controversy around. They're way more likely to ask those things if they're able to ask them in anonymous ways. And you can still answer them for the group. Like, the response doesn't have to change, but the experience of asking them, the difference between holding up your hand and saying a question out loud versus typing it in, on a live polling chat or writing it down on an index card and handing it in, those are fundamentally different experiences for our participants. So being anonymous and not having to be the one that's asking the group, like asking or articulating the question out loud, those 2 components to anonymous Q&A really lower the risk for asking questions. So again, those are being anonymous and not having to articulate your question out loud. The other structure that you can use to ask anonymous or to get your group to ask you questions is something entirely different. And I call this structure frequently asked questions. So if we're leading a conversation that we've led many, many times before, or that we know what people are worried about, questioning, wondering, going in, then it's easy for us as facilitators to make a list of questions ahead of time. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't know those things, the conversation that you're leading is new to you, or you are just not sure exactly what the group was going to be wondering, you could actually do anonymous Q&A to create that pre-existing list. So having the list before the workshop starts is really important, because what you're going to do is you're going to number those questions. I usually say no more than 8. So number them 1 to 8. And there's a few filters that are important here. 1, only put questions on that list that you actually are ready and willing to answer. So sometimes as facilitators, we're always thinking about, how do I lower the risk for my participants? And this structure also allows us to lower the risk for ourselves, right? It can be really tricky when we are getting anonymous questions that we don't know how to answer, or, not anonymous, when people are asking questions in a workshop that we don't know how to answer. That can feel like a really high risk kind of thing. And so a lot of facilitators will just avoid giving people the opportunity to ask questions. Anonymous questions gives us a chance to filter them. We don't have to answer every single one, especially if we're the only ones who can see them. But frequently asked questions ups that even more. So we decide ahead of time, what are the questions that we are willing to answer? We put those questions on a numbered list, and then we put that list up in front of participants. If you're online, you're going to do that on a slide. If you're in person, I will usually do that on a flip chart paper, and then I will read out the question questions. So number 1 is this, number 2 is this. And then all you ask people to do is to shout out a number. They can put it in the chat, they could message you directly if you really want to keep it anonymous, or they can just say number 2. And what's awesome about that is you know what questions are coming because you've decided them ahead of time, and they get to feel a sense of agency over what they're choosing. Like they get to say, I wanted number 2 and not number 7. They get agency in choice in those questions, but they don't have to say the questions out loud. They just have to say the number. And so you can say, okay, number 2, cool. And then you read out the question and then you answer it and then you repeat the process. So I love doing frequently asked questions when I'm nervous as a facilitator, or when I'm worried that people aren't going to ask what they really need to ask and I'm totally willing to address. It works with a crowd of 200 people and it works with a group of 6. And frequently asked questions can be a super powerful way to get people to ask questions and to articulate questions without you or the group having to take any significant amount of social risk. Okay, so I think we're going to end there for the moment. If you found this conversation interesting, I would love to know what stood out to you. What are the things that you agree with? What are the things that you disagree with? What are the ways that you find most tricky to lower risk in meetings? And what are the things that you found that worked? I am destroying the principle of being a facilitator around only ask one question if you want people to answer. So I gave you a bunch of questions, so let me give you one in case you need some more direction. I would love to know, what is a situation that you encounter as a facilitator where you would like more help or support understanding how to lower the risk in that circumstance? I would love to see those scenarios. And if you leave one below in the comments, I promise to get back to you with my own ideas or to crowdsource them and come back to you with others. So thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. I really hope you are having a wonderful May. And until next time, happy facilitating.